Molly, I think that actually ties to what Anne was arguing earlier about the structural hidden inequalities that already existed in societies, and quite interestingly, societies that are hit harder by COVID. We can see how intensified the inequalities were in these countries. And so I'll just pose that question because that goes towards that direction in terms of using COVID as a cover story. How do you think COVID has been used as a cover story in different contexts, not necessarily about the UK, but in different contexts? For example, in terms of the US, Trump has used that towards the end of his campaign, that the kind of unemployment rates were only because of COVID. And so I wondered how you would link that to this political story, dominant story, as Anne argued, being used to cover up or to muddy other stories that exist.
I think I'm going to sit out because I just made a long comment about that. I think it's a hugely important question, and let's make room for the others to respond.
So shall we move to Jill then?
Okay, I don't know that what I'm going to say responds directly to the question of cover, but I did want to just pick up this idea of inequalities that Anne introduced earlier. So South Africa is, by most reckonings, the most unequal society in the world. And so COVID for us has been just about it has been so starkly about those inequalities. Just this morning, the police fired water cannons at people standing in queues waiting to obtain social grants. Some of these people, so these are either elderly people or people with disabilities. Some of these people have been standing in these queues for up to 3 days, in fact, sleeping overnight in what isn't cold, but are wet conditions often. So you can imagine the kind of sense of desperation of people not wanting to lose a place in a queue for a basic grant that really will do little more than those food parcels that Anne was describing, just to keep people from starving. And of course, this queue is not orderly and social distancing is not happening. So apparently what happened was the police issued an kind of instruction that people must social distance, and they gave them, according to news reports, 1 minute to conform with that instruction. And when they did not, they fired water cannons at these people. So I suppose the thing that is incredibly anxiety provoking is in all kinds of ways that that we might think that the exposure of inequalities is a kind of like a provocation to greater equality, to activism, to social justice. It can also just simply be a kind of space in which the power of the state in very overt kinds of ways can be exercised to maintain the status quo. And that for me has been one of the deepest kind of sadnesses, that at the beginning of the pandemic, I really did have a sense that perhaps this is going to be something that cracks things open and makes us all realize that we're dependent on each other. And that, in fact, if the poor do not have healthcare and do not have access to basic livelihood, that's a problem for the entire world, for the rich as well. But that seems to me to not be where the story's heading, Ruth. And that's, I suppose, that anxiety of, because we don't know what the conclusion of the story is, we can't kind of put things in place and see where they're leading us. So whether the stories are covered up or exposed, to me feels less important than what we do with the stories as they emerge.
Thank you. And Kathy?
I'm very interested in how COVID is being used as a cover by institutions to do things that they have wanted to do for a long time. One of the things that I'm seeing in the US, and I live in a community with a number of liberal arts colleges around me, one of the things that I'm seeing is the discovery, apparently, by administrators that a great deal can be done online. You don't need classrooms. You don't need the dialogue that can happen, the exchanges of stories that can happen in a face-to-face classroom. Instead, you can think about providing education in a much more hierarchical model, offline, and thereby cut. And I'm particularly seeing it in the US with liberal arts majors. As some of you know, I have this deep interest in classical music, and I'm watching in colleges around me, these departments, you know, the younger professors being very clear that they're not going to be retained because of the ways in which the colleges are seeing them as not profit centers and not yielding the number of majors that they want. So this very meaningful work to build knowledge about musical structures and how they have changed over time and the way communication happens is being eclipsed in favor of engineering, other vocationally oriented majors. So I think that COVID has provided the rationale, if you will, for big institutional changes that have been in the works for a while, but now there is a medical reason, and so on. So I think we really, as activists, have to guard against this and fight back.
Thank you, Kathy. That's a very important point. And I have another question in relation to that, but I'll open Anne. Anne, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you. And building on what Kathy said just then, because I think that one of the ways in which COVID is used as a cover story is to do with galloping privatization. In the United Kingdom, we saw the government, what the government has all the time been giving contracts quietly to people who are nothing more than friends, actually, you know, or donors to the Conservative Party. And we saw huge failures, huge loss of money with the supply of PPE. We've seen what they've done just now with the delivery of school meals and delivery of computers and so on. And there are many other examples. So that's one, things that were government agenda anyway. Another is to do with migration. And here, it's not so much that COVID is being used as a cover story, but that the story of COVID gives cover to carry on with some of the things that were already in planning around migration of asylum seekers, but also thinking about Brexit and so on. So I think it gives a cover at that level. I also think in terms of the cover story for us and them divisions. And there are quite a few findings that actually Dominic Cummings' behaviour, much as it was justified by the government, did lead many people to think, well, you know, I've made all these sacrifices. I've had people die in care homes where I could not hold, you know, my mother's hand or whatever. but yet here's somebody who can drive 26 miles to test his eyesight because he's got COVID, just in case, and also, drive to see his parents when ill. And there have been other things like that. So us-them distinctions. And I think that one of the interesting things was when Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the opposition party, yesterday said to Boris Johnson, is this something that you would like to give your children to eat? That calling out of that us-them distinction, because nobody could then say, yes, we think that's a great 10 days food for all children, or anything like that. So that's another one. And I think that what has been interesting for political psychology is, and it's to do with independent sage as well, is that us-them distinction has been one that they have called out all the time. So people like Steve Reicher, who has over the last 30 years been saying that actually, what matters are the groupings to which people belong, drawing on the social identity theory and self-categorization and so on, has pointed out that actually we can't get out of the COVID situation unless we're appealed to as part of us, unless there's a we-ness. And one of the things that I've been really struck by is that there are now loads of these psychology papers published with 50 people, 60 people as authors, 40 people as authors, all making that point that leadership in a time of COVID has to recognize groupness, that we're not individual, and it has to deal with that. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which there's actually an opposition from psychology. And I think that actually, for those outside Britain, that message, sort of Steve Reicher has said it repeatedly from an so I'm tripping up because we call it indie sage, but it's actually independent sage perspective. And on radio a few days ago, it really went home, and the British Broadcasting Corporation had started including stories of people who, rather than just having stories of people who are breaking the rules, the stories of people who've gone out of their way to try to help make sure that COVID becomes a thing of the past at great self-sacrifice. So he's actually had an impact through all the discussions that there have been in independent sage and so on. One other thing that I would say is that thinking about also something that Kathy was saying, thinking about the way in which universities are in a bit of a crisis for how they think about themselves and their students. So in Britain, independent sage pleaded with the government and universities not to have students moving en masse back to university after the summer, because we'd seen already in many other countries that the moment that happens, you get this huge uptick in COVID cases, which is exactly what happened. But one of the things that happened was that universities did not want to lose the money from, for example, housing for students. And they therefore said that they would make provision, and they didn't. So there were numerous cases where young people immediately got COVID. And it wasn't that they were immediately ill, although it remains to be seen how many of them have long COVID, but actually that what happened was then they were locked in, often with nobody having made proper provision for them to be fed, or anybody having thought about how they would wash their clothes. And with this being the first time that 18-year-olds had been away from their parental homes. So universities felt themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place. It wasn't that that the people involved were being nasty, but actually the creeping monetarization of universities, the ways in which a neoliberal university means that they no longer care about staff or students in the same way, even if the individuals who are at the top of them think they do, I think opens up all sorts of cans of worms and possibilities that build on what Kathy was saying about that. And that's another way in which COVID has given a cover story for changes that are happening anyway.
Thank you very much. Corinne?
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to be just simply expanding on what people have said. I do think that there are a lot of cover stories in operation, not all concealing ones, in fact, because a cover story is almost like an abstract with a lot a kind of expanded story under it. And some of those expanded stories are a bit like the cover of a book, so that you open it up and there's a lot more there that you can actually see. So some of those cover stories are, in a sense, opening up rather than concealing. But I think it's rather clear, obviously, as people have said, that, you know, COVID is operated as a cover story around privatization, around precaritization of work, the renewal of various workers' contracts on worse terms, around the removal of aid, which has been particularly dramatic, I think, and also justified by COVID. And then within the epidemic, or within the UK, let's say, COVID has acted as a cover story around, I think, the normalization of health inequalities. You know, we hear a lot about them and nothing happens. It's become normal to have a report and nothing to happen on the basis of that report. So the normalization also of death and morbidity, that's become, you know, the notion of endemicity around COVID has been entirely normalized by government, at least, not by people responding to it. So there's been a lot of layers of this kind of normalization, I think, and yet, and particularly somebody mentioned in the chat, you know, around schools and stuff, a normalization of an idea of risk, such that you're not really a proper citizen unless you take risk with your life. If you're a working class person, anyway, that you go to, you do risky work, you use risky transport, you live in risky circumstances, and in this way you service the safety of middle class people. So it's become a very classed cover story as well, or the normalization that it supports, at least. But at the same time, I do think that there's this other sense of in which COVID narratives have uncovered for a lot of people, as we've been saying, you know, an understanding of health inequalities, intensified inequalities, food poverty most recently, the nature of social care, all these kinds of things. Those have become more understood, I think. And perhaps we've also understood, this is something that Achille Mbembe has talked about a lot in his paper, The Right to Breathe, that, you know, ultimately, for all this this kind of cover story around, you know, like the middle class people protecting themselves and protecting their profits and continuing to be able to work and have fun and so on at the expense of others. Ultimately, we all have to breathe, and this virus is not interested in these trade-offs. You know, this is not flu. And this is not something that responds to notions of herd immunity. This is something that mutates and gets serious and kills you. And it's not something that can, in fact, ultimately be just left in an anxious space, as Ruth put it. It's going to consume that anxious space unless it's removed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Corinne. And in relation to all of this, and then I'll open up to Sharon, who wants to ask a question. I just wanted to add another dimension to this, which we should come back to, and that's the transnational or the international aspects of global pandemic. That much of the narratives around COVID, either as a cover story or as the true story, let's say, was nationalized. We saw even the borders came back within the EU, and that how European countries during the first lockdown, they started kind of thinking about inwards, for example, Italy closing borders with France and so on. So I would like us to come back to that if possible, thinking about global inequalities. And now currently with the kind of vaccination and the programs around vaccination. So that is another aspect of intensified inequalities and using COVID as a cover story. Sharon Cohen has got a question.
Hello, thank you so much. I am just so fascinated by the, sorry for the cat, I'm a terrible mom, have no authority over her, but I wrote a paper with Talia Maglioglu, should come out soon, in which we argue that this is a momentous opportunity to kind of rediscuss the idea of survival. And we argue that COVID brought up this in terms of social representation, the hegemonic social representation of survival. And what we try to do in that paper is to kind of link COVID with climate change and say there are dimensions in these two gigantic crises that are in common in terms of what they imply for survival. And I agree with Anne. I mean, I love to see how and Professor Phoenix, to see how writers' work and independent states' work actually ultimately succeeded in affecting the way in which coverage of COVID has moved. Okay, so my question, however, is obviously it's important to see this change, and I want to learn how do we get there, because then we can possibly apply it also to the climate change and try to see how we can kind of use the lessons learned from this crisis for the next crisis that some refuse to see, but is coming.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to comment on that? Anne, Molly?
Well, I